What up YouTube, Cyber here. It's been a while since I made my first dub bass tutorial, and since then my workflow has changed quite a bit, and I have some different techniques for making basses that I thought I'd share with you. I've also been mixing them a little bit differently, so I'm going to share that as well. So if you want to support me, please subscribe to the channel and also check out the description box below. I've just released a preset pack for Vital called the Psydub Toolkit Volume 1. It's got tons of great basses, sequences, skanks, percussions, everything you need to start making Psydub and find inspiration. So definitely check that out, and let's get into it. Okay, so I have my default patch here in Vital, and I'm going to note that my default patch has phase randomization at 0, so I don't forget when I'm making basses or things that I want consistent phase. I don't forget to turn that down, and then if I'm doing a lead or something, I can turn it up. The other thing that I do in my default patch is I like to have basic shapes so I can easily get to all these shapes and when I'm doing sound design stuff. But we're going to just start with a sine wave, and this might be hard to hear a little bit if you're on speakers because we're going to be talking about some lower octaves. But what I like to do is pull up Curve or any other metering plugin where you can see a reference track's basic shape and the average curve for it, and you can actually download the demo to Curve here and do that. Even there's occasional noise that plays, but that like still works for metering stuff. But Curve is a great plugin. You know, there are other options, but I like Curve. And one thing that I like to do first is help get a consistent sub level. And one thing that I've noticed when making basses is that these lower octaves, like this song is in E, so if I play a low E, well, first I'm going to bring this down an octave for a bass. If I play this low E, you'll see it's peaking at a pretty good spot for this reference track. And then, but if I play it higher up, it gets really loud compared to our reference in that area, and you'll find that it just, these higher octaves totally dominate compared to the lower ones. So one thing we can do here is grab note, the note modulation, and drag it over to our level and pull it down a little bit here. And then what we can do is open up our mod remap here, and we can play this low E and see that if I double click here and create a node sort of in whatever key I'm in, if I bring it down, it's going to get louder. And if I bring it up, it's going to get quieter. So then I can play my top E here, or even higher. Let's say I want to go and I'm playing some notes up towards C. And we're going to just dial in this curve like this and be like, all right, if I'm playing up there, you know, I might not actually have enough. Here we go. Let's pull this down so we have more range to work with and go back. That's too much. So now I can get my sub level dialed in like this so that the higher notes versus the lower notes are at a more consistent volume. And that's really helpful when making patches. When you get into your song. So that's kind of the shapes, you know, that I use most of the time when it comes to my sub. So one thing you might notice right now is that if you play your bass line, there's a slight click from having 0 attack on that sine wave, if you listen closely. Which sounds okay at the moment if you were just going to use the patch straight up sine clean bass, but if you are going to do downstream processing, adding like 0.010 attack like that can still have your bass sounding punchy without that click, and it just won't cause problems down the line. It's like faintly there. If it becomes a problem down the line, you can always add a touch more attack. All right, now that we have the fundamental frequency of our bass dialed in, one of the things I like to do is add harmonics so that the bass has a little bit more weight and comes through on small speakers. And I used to do this right here on the wavetable, but I've taken to doing it in a separate oscillator now because it gives us more options for processing the harmonics separately from the fundamental when we're trying to dial in. You know, we can put saturation perhaps on just the harmonics of the bass and get different colors and tune our bass a little bit more easily. So one thing I like to do is knock this down to the same as oscillator 1, and probably we don't need quite as much level. And now we can pull up this and take a look at our spectrum analyzer while we do this. And here's the fundamental, which is covered in the other oscillator. So we're going to pull that out and we're going to start putting in harmonics like this. So let's hold a note on our keyboard here. And you can see adding some weight. And what I like to go for is a nice cascade down this way. And we're trying to sort of cover our low mid area so that it's balanced. And one thing you do have to watch out for is pushing up some of these harmonics too much will often make your bass sound a little out of tune, especially when you add saturation down the line. So you have to be careful not to overdo this. Certain harmonics will sound a little bit more out of tune than others, or like if you're in a space where, you know, the wrong frequencies are emphasized in your room, it just won't translate as well. It can make the bass sound a little out of tune. So sometimes so don't overdo this. But here's our fundamental, and we'll create this kind of a cascade down like this. But sometimes less is more. And Vital's actually normalized, so if you bring, it normalizes these wave tables, so you have more room to play with. If, say, you crank this up and then hop back over for a second and then get your level of that first harmonic about right like that, and now hop back in the wave table, and you've got a lot more room to play with to really get it how you want it. You'll see if I crank this one up, I'm exaggerating it. It'll sound kind of out of tune. So it's more natural to have this kind of a shape down. You still want your fundamental frequency to dominate. Something like this. And you'll see as we're getting higher that the harmonics are getting a little bit too loud. So what I'm going to do is also note remap this. And I'm actually going to just hop into the matrix and copy and just paste it in right here. So now have it bring it down a little bit. The harmonics are more important when you're playing the low notes, so a slightly steeper curve for the harmonics here on the remap can be good. Because when you're playing higher bass notes, those are going to come through those smaller speakers and through your mix a little easier anyway. All right, let's talk about saturation a little bit. Now that we have separate control of oscillator 1 and 2, we can actually take advantage of the different saturation types in Vital's filters. We have, distortion types over here, like soft clip and all these. which are cool. But I really do like a lot of these saturations in the filters, and these first 5 filters all have a drive knob. And this diode one is maybe a little more aggressive than the analog one. And so what we might do is grab a macro and bring it over to the level of our harmonics, just so that we have a bit more fine control over sort of how much of the harmonics are in our bass sound down the road. So harmonics, that should be roughly the same. I think we were right about somewhere in there. And now I've got pretty fine control if I want to sort of level match with how much distortion I'm adding from this filter. You can see that if I drive it all the way, I can then bring it down a bit, and it's a different color. And if we wanted to thicken up the sub, we might, try the analog one there. How much I dirty up my sub really depends on the track. Like on a, maybe a more down tempo kind of track, I might want to keep my sub cleaner. Certain genres call for a dirtier sub. Like if I'm doing like a dirty dub track and I want something a little thicker, I'm going to saturate both and use different types, and how they sort of gel together really can help you get different colors. And instead of driving one type of saturation really hard, I really am a big fan of doing multi-stage saturation, because the way that they interact and intermodulate can really bring out different tones and shape your bass tone. And that is like, totally your subjective choice and how you fit that bass to your track and get a good tone. That's kind of the fun of it, is playing with how the different saturations interact. One other side note is that like Vital is really great for this, but you could set up this exact same thing in Phase Plant and then say process your harmonics with Convolver and use like different mic impulse responses or guitar cabs. Like you could use a guitar cab on just this oscillator and maybe a bass cab impulse response on your fundamental and get some really cool tones out of that. So if you have Phase Plant, definitely experiment with setting up these 2 different oscillators and processing them differently to get different colors. That's really fun too. All right, now let's check out what this sounds like with these 2 distortions together. I kind of like this dirty one. All right. Too much of the dirty kind of changes the character of the bass for me, but I like the combination of the analog and the dirty together here. Let's hear it in context. Pretty sick. Now, another thing I like to do is to layer, to think about this sort of mid-range and high-end separately. And layering in a sample for attack is one good way. We'll talk about another way to sort of handle that mid-range area in a minute. In my preset pack, I include a folder of bass and guitar samples that I recorded. And one that we might use here is Cyber's Telly. and let's just see what this sounds like layered in. And what we want to do is create an envelope and go to seconds and take smoothing off. And we can control how much of the telly attack goes on to the bass. So I often like to get a curve a little bit like this, and 0.5 might be a little long, but let's just see what it sounds like first. Also, these are all recorded in C, so if you just turn on key tracking and turn off the cycle, then you should be good to go. Sometimes you might need to kick them down or up an octave. Let's see what Cyber's Telly sounds like here. So another thing that I might do here is just route this to the effects or directly out, depending on what I'm doing, and then take my sample and bring that into the other filter. Because sometimes some of these samples have too much lower end clashing with what you've set up down below, and what we're really just after is the top end. Some of these samples that I've set up are just the mid-range, so they're pre-filtered for doing exactly this, just adding mid-range, not even like high or low. You might have here, let's check this out. So one thing I might do here with this sample is just low cut it like this. Let's hear just the sample for a sec. Gives a nice punch there. All right, let's hear it in context. You can really shape how much of this sound you want in, whether you just want the beginning of the sound or you want the whole sample, or, you know, adjust the level, whether you want it sort of subtly in there to bring out the attack of the bass, but that's a good way to go. You know, you might try this tweed muted guitar is pretty nice. Let's see what that sounds like. Now, another cool thing you can do with these samples, or any samples you record on your own to add interesting mid-range, is let's say you take some of these samples and, you can drop, let's take, where's the warm bass. Now let's take this and drop it into pitch slice, and then we'll grab another envelope here and set it to seconds, and I'm just gonna solo this up here for a second, and we're going to route this. We're not going to use this one, so we'll route this to filter 1 for now. And what I'm going to do is use this envelope to move through the wavetable. And let's see what this sounds like on its own for a second. You see, we've really covered this mid-range area a bit more. Now that can really help the bass come through on small speakers if you combine them here. You have options. I actually liked this a little bit more guitar-y, how we had it. Let's hear it in context. Nice. All right, let's get into the mixing a little bit. In my preset pack, I do some of this mixing here in Vital itself so that the patches are good to go, but mostly in my projects, I'm doing it outside of Vital. And one of the things I like to do is tighten my sub up a little bit, because that low sub can just really be a little bit overwhelming, you know, in cars and places like that. So, or bigger systems. And so having a nice tight sub for your dub bass is important. And I don't like to compress my entire bass as much as I like to compress my sub. So multi-band is a good option for this. I like to use Pro MB because it just offers a lot of control. If you don't have Pro MB, Nova by TDR is a great free plugin, which you can accomplish a lot of this same stuff. It might be kind of hard to hear unless you are on headphones. And I like to crank the volume up when I'm working on the sub a bunch too, so I can really hear the attack. So I recommend doing that. And what I like to do is create a band down low, somewhere between 60 and 70, and really crank up the ratio and exaggerate the compression a bit on this while I'm getting it dialed in. So with it off, if I have it soloed up, make sure I can hear it. All right, that's my sub. And if I turn this on and grab free here so I can control, the low sub can be a bit sluggish sometimes. So what I like to do is use this free band to sort of pull off the very back here. And, you know, having it set somewhere around 40 to 100 tends to get a quicker dynamic response from the compression. So I feel like that's a good idea a lot of the time if you have that option in Pro MB. And then I'm going to really pull down on the threshold a bit, and we're going to set the attack. And if the attack is too slow, it's really going to sort of kill that initial transient. And if you have it too long, it can be like a little too loose and flubby. So usually between like 30 and 40% seems to be a sweet spot for those like repeated notes especially, and a pretty fast release because you don't want it smoothing out those repeated notes. So I'm going to start with it like pretty fast, and then I might let up a little bit, because if you have your release like all the way too fast, it can create some unwanted distortion. So let's hear what it sounds like right now, soloed up. All right, so that's tightening it up pretty nicely, and I can hear the attack. I'm not sure if that's coming through on your end, unless you're on better speakers, but what I often do is the compression's a little bit too aggressive now, so I'm going to pull back on the ratio. I want at least 5 or 6 probably. And I'm going to compare it to the dry. Too much of a volume difference there, so. All right. I don't know if you can tell now, but if I turn this off to bypass while it's still soloed, you can really hear how that's tightening up the sub. And off. All right, that was way too loud. All right, so now that we've got our sub dialed in, let's talk about why we might do some further compression on the whole bass. You know, I don't always do it, but sometimes the bass needs a little bit of leveling. Sometimes you can kind of improve the overall dynamics and get like the perfect attack and release of the bass. It's hit or miss, and I think it's important to level match to make sure you're not fooling yourself with volume. Now, let's pull up Pro C2 for this because it's nice and visual, and turn off auto gain, because sometimes when doing this method, the auto gain can kind of fool me a little, as weird as that sounds. But so first I'm going to crank up the ratio like all the way, nearly all the way, and bring the threshold way down, and we're going to like totally overdo it for a minute. And I like to, again, ignore the really sluggish lows there, so I'm going to just turn on the sidechain filter. All right, let's see what we're getting here. So really overdoing it here, and you can hear we're just totally smashing that transient. Now if we pull up, what we're looking for is listening to just the attack of the bass. It is getting a bit louder as we pull up on that attack. All right. Oddly enough, sometimes a little bit of a curve to the attack of the compression, like having the bass note not like immediately go from 0 to 100, having a little bit of time and a little bit of curve can actually emphasize the punch I found of the dub bass. Now, this release is way too fast, and we want to sort of add a little bit of energy, and so that's what we're going to be listening for. We want it to be really letting up quickly after that attack, and that can add a little bit of bounce to the bass. Really listening for those fast notes. This would be too fast. Right about there for this. Okay, so now that we've got our attack and release dialed in, we're going to really lay off this, and it's going to be quite subtle in the end. With bass, I like to go like with a pretty light ratio, something like between 1 and 2. And we're going to pull this up, and it's going to be subtle, but let's see where we're at here. We just want a slight curve, and we're going to adjust the knee a little bit. Let's see where it ends up with the threshold. And we can look over here to see how we're comparing them level-wise. You want chocolate? Yeah. All right, hold on. Sorry about that. The girl needed chocolate. So, let's take a look. Where were we? I'm going to change the scale so I can really see what's happening here. And go back so I can see the level. We're still pretty close here. Let's bypass. So it's pretty subtle. But I do think it's affecting the groove a little bit, and it's not hurting the bass, giving it a little energy. We could try going a little bit more extreme here and see if we like it. We're making it a little quieter, so. Looking good. Doing 1 to 3 dB of compression. Good place to be for doing light compression on bass. And you'll notice here that we're getting a little bit more compression on these faster notes, and that's definitely leveling out. You can see from the longer notes, and that's kind of what we're after here. We're controlling the dynamics. We're not squashing the attack of the bass. We got that all set up good before we started doing this finer stuff by setting the attack and release with it totally overdone. So definitely give that a try when you're compressing bass. So one other trick you can do to get a tight dub bass that can be used in conjunction with what we've already done here by compressing the sub, or you can not compress your sub because it's a little bit less necessary if you employ this technique. Now, there's some analog hardware units that kind of have this baked into them. Cush's Hammer is one that does this. Trying to think of some others, but basically the way these are designed is they have a filter that seems like a little bit drastic for just using on its own, something like a 6 dB filter at anywhere from like 80 to 90 hertz. And this is really going to cut our sub away. If we take a look here, it really cuts those lows. But what is good about this is that we can then take our favorite distortion EQ, saturating EQ. My personal favorite might be the Kelvin Tone Shaper. Spectre is also pretty good for this, but if I take the Kelvin Tone Shaper here and pull this up, we have our 2-stage distortion, and we can either, this is gain compensated drive into a low shelf, and this is like control over the shelf. So we can control how much distortion is like, this is pulling back before distortion, so it's driving it less hard, or we can drive it harder, which is nice. And we're looking at, 100 hertz and down, which is pretty good, but that's probably about right. So our cutoff's at 80. Let's just say we're going to drive this at around 80. And let's pick one of these distortion types. Boutique is really nice. And what we're going to do with this is I tend to like to pull the mix down a little bit. But what we're going to do is boost, get a little bit of saturation going, and then boost it back up to where it was. So let's give this a try. Let's overdo it. All right, so let's check this out. Here is both plugins bypassed. We're peaking around 12.2. And now let's turn on the filter and this and get it close. We did it. Look at that. Off. All right, and back on one more time. So that's something you can try to tighten up the low end, is driving into a filter with your favorite saturating EQ. I recommend the Kelvin Tone Shaper because it's got lots of other options that are really sweet. You can even boost into it with a Pultec type shape. And it's also got these harmonics, and you can sort of, if you're getting too much fuzz, you can clean it up this way. And this your bass still feels pretty mono. This is subtle, but it creates slightly different harmonics on the left and right, which give it just a touch of width without it like being stereo really. And let's show you that. You can also hold shift and drive it a little harder if you want. Let's hear what this bass sounds like in context. And you'll see that this sub isn't getting away from us down here anymore. All right, so one other cool thing about this technique is it can be done on the other end too for like drums and percussion. If you want that kind of old school smooth top end on your drums, you can also do a similar thing where you might do 6 dB at around 8K, something like that, and then drive up with a distorted EQ into that cut up there. And it gets a really nice smooth top end for your drums, but you don't want to kill the air. It depends on the mix. I don't do that on everything. I do that if my high end is maybe feeling a little bit harsh and I want to smooth it out with some saturation and really control the sort of, get a more of an old school high end. I don't know what else to call it, but that is a cool, fun trick. All right, so I hope you guys found this video helpful. I will save this preset and include it in my Vital Pack, which will be out by the time I release this video, and I will upload it for my $1 Patreon supporters as well. Thank you to everyone who supports me by picking up the pack. I hope you find the presets inspiring and educational. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Hit the like button and say hello in the comments. All right, cheers, guys. Peace out.